usually by about January 21, those New Year's resolutions have gone out the window.
It almost sounds like you're saying that willpower isn't even really a thing.
It's easy for us to use that word to describe a set of experiences that we have in such a way that the story we tell ourselves is, I either have this quality or I don't have this quality. Other people seem to have more of it and other people seem to have less of it. The number of theories of behavioural change in which you find willpower identified as a factor of change is precisely zero.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Science Radio. My name is Jesse Herford and I'm joined by Zanita Fletcher. G'day, Zanita.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are talking to Simon Matthews. Simon, a returning guest to the podcast. You have written a fantastic article for us today, which we will talk about in just a minute. But first, hello, how are you? Thank you for joining us.
Hello, very well. Thank you for having me back again. It's lovely to be back with you. Evidently, I didn't do too much damage the first time. Because you invited me back. So
let's see if we can do a little bit more damage today. See how far we can get. Before we get into the topic at hand, I'd like to paint a picture. All right, dear listener, I want you to imagine in your mind's eye that it is January 1st. Now, by the time you go to watch or listen to this podcast, we'll be well into February. But I just want to imagine you go back to January 1st and it's the morning and you wake up and the day is hopefully bright and sunny, as every January 1st should be. And you see in the corner of your room a tank top or some active wear, some runners. You've got a salad mix in the fridge ready to go, maybe a protein shake, some protein powder, some healthy stuff. And you greet the day with an overwhelming, perhaps you could even say inordinate sense of optimism and joy. And so you jump out of bed and you put on your runners and you put on your activewear and you go for that run, or you go for the gym, or you do the CrossFit or whatever, or you eat that Greek yogurt with protein powder, and you feel really, really good. All right. But then a few days go by and your routine, whilst it's still going, it's not as exciting as it was. And then a few more days go by, and then a few more days, and then suddenly you're getting toward the end of January, maybe even where we are now at the beginning of Feb, and something has slipped. And you wake up in the same room with the same stuff in the corner, but the habit and the enthusiasm and the, dare I say, willpower to get up, to jump in that gear, to go for that run, to do that CrossFit, to eat that healthy salad rather than a couple of slices of pizza, that has just gone completely out the window. And this gear, these salads, all these accoutrements that was once a symbol of hope, the new you, is now a reminder of your failure and maybe your lack of willpower. Now, Simon, I believe that perhaps that might be a familiar story for a lot of people all around the world.
Guilty.
Okay, me too.
Absolutely. Well, Jesse, you're describing the world's longest running behaviour change experiment there, and there's an iteration of that behaviour change experiment which starts on about December 29 or December 30 every year, and it continues until about January 21 the following year. I will say you're being a little. I heard you say maybe about the time we are now, which is early February, you're being a little optimistic in thinking that people sort of continue those New Year's changes up until that point. But the pattern is very, very predictable. So on about December 29 or December 30, people start thinking, I'm in the new year, I'm going to do this. I've got to do this. I'm going to change this, and I'm going to go to the gym, and I'm going to eat lettuce leaves and steam Brussels sprouts, and all these sorts of things that they're absolutely determined to do. And December 31 rolls around. People wake up on January 1 in pretty much the mindset you talked about. Fantastic, new year. I'm gonna do this. So they do it January 1, and then they do it January 2 the next day, and then they do it January 3 as well. So they got 3 days in a row. This is going fantastically. Typically, January 4, maybe January 5 is when people start to return to work after the new year. So January 4, people go back to work. I didn't. Maybe I'll just didn't quite get organised, or I'll do a shorter run today, or didn't quite get to the gym. That's okay. I'll go tomorrow. So they go on January 5. January 5 goes well. January 6 maybe goes well. January 7 something will happen. There'll be some New Year project at work, or one of your kids will need something. You've got to do that, or something will go on. A friend will invite you for lunch on the weekend after New Year, something like that. January 7, it doesn't happen. January 8, doesn't happen either. January 9, you remember, I've got to do this. I've got to get back to this. So you do it on January 9. January 10 slips again. January 11, January 12, all sort of go by. January 13, you go, Ria, what's wrong with you? Come on, do this. So you do it January 13, January 14. January 15 is the weekend, and it's been a busy couple of weeks to start the year. So you just, chill out a little bit. You miss it January 15, January 16. You miss it January 17. You miss it January 18. On January 19, you think, I'm going to get back into that tomorrow. January 20, you don't. End of January 20, you think, no, definitely tomorrow. You don't. And that pretty much describes the start of the year. So usually by about January 21, for the vast majority of people, those New Year's resolutions have pretty much gone out the window, or they've people find a way of minimising them, or constraining them, or containing them in some way. So it was going to be every morning I'm going to have a berry smoothie and chia seed porridge, and then at lunch I'm going to have a green smoothie. I'm going to spend 2 hours at the gym, and so on and so forth. And by January 21, that might be on weekends I'll squeeze some orange juice, and pretty continuously through the year, because all the time people are making decisions about, right, tomorrow I'm going to start this, tomorrow I'm going to start doing this, or next Monday I'm going to start doing this, and that pattern is often very, very similar. That if I get to go for a walk each day, that's good. So there's a significant shift around that time. World's longest running behaviour change experiment, and it does happen. It happens not just at New Year, of course. It happens. People start enthusiastically. Life happens. There's a couple interruptions. They get disrupted. They feel a sense of guilt and regret. They go back to it. They push through a little bit more. Something else happens, as it inevitably will, and then the number of concentrated days where the work is being done reduce, and the number of days where whatever the change is not being done increase until that early wave kind of evens out again, and it just becomes a little rumble.
I'm sure this is something we can all relate to. And if there's someone who can't relate to this and hasn't had this experience, would love to have you on the podcast and hear your secrets. But I feel like,
indeed,
I don't know whether it's the talk about goals at the end of a year and the start of a year, whether it's the fireworks, whether it's the whole ins and outs kind of thing that gets us excited. But at some point early in the journey, we seem to have this decline of this decline of motivation. But before we kind of find solutions to that and unpack that and explore that more, can we get back to basics? Because I feel like, your article is titled, You Don't Need More Willpower. But is willpower the same thing as motivation and self-control and discipline? Because these words kind of get thrown around interchangeably.
Exactly right.
But is there a
Yeah.
difference? What is willpower? What are we talking about when we say that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Zanita, and in fact, I think this is a significant part of the problem, and why we see these things happen. Let's start with something that's very important first. If you survey all the theories of behavioural change, and there are many of them. In about 15 years ago, some researchers published an article in which they identified about 83 or 84 theories of behavioural change. About 10 years ago, a different group of researchers were interested in what is it that sustains behavioural change. They identified, I think, 117 theories of behavioural change. Many of them are derivatives from others. Many of them are quite similar. They differ maybe by only one factor or something like that. Nevertheless, we can say that there is a very large number of theories of behavioural change, and the number of theories of behavioural change in which you find willpower identified as a factor of change is precisely zero. Willpower just isn't something that's spoken about. When you get to if you like, the scientific or the research perspective on behavioural change, willpower just doesn't factor into it. We don't talk about willpower as a key element of behavioural change, and there's some good reasons for that. The first is that willpower largely comes from, or the notion of willpower largely comes from narrative discourses that influence cultures over time. So if you go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, several thousand years, there was discussion of the virtue of self-control. If you go back several hundred years to medieval times, medieval scholars used to make this connection between the idea of willpower and your moral character or moral strength. If we go back a couple hundred years, the idea of discipline and virtue kind of emerged again. People who have willpower, whatever that is, are considered to be well-disciplined and virtuous people. The willpower idea is repeated through many religious traditions, including Christian religious traditions, and we have everyday language that reinforces these ideas. For example, we talk about people with an iron will, as if that's a good thing. He's got an iron will to do this, or she's really iron-willed about this. And so we set up willpower as a virtue or personal characteristic that we admire and aspire to. And the corresponding side of that is that we tend to look a little bit sideways when we think that willpower is absent. So one of the challenges we have is that willpower is not an operationalized concept in scientific and research theories of behavior change. It's a narrative concept. It's a cultural concept that seems to have flowed through many different cultural and religious traditions over time. But we can't actually say, this is willpower. This is exactly what it looks like.
Help me understand, because a couple things, Simon. Number one, it almost sounds like you're saying that willpower isn't even really a thing, or at least it's not a thing that can be measured or quantified or reduced down to its subatomic particles. Is it simply the stuff of stories and of legends?
Largely, I think it is. Yeah, largely, I think it is. And I think one of the challenges is that it does actually, at some level, we can feel like it's real. For example, let me perhaps use a metaphor here. Let's imagine that. Let's imagine that there's a particular parking spot outside the grocery store that you find very convenient for you. Maybe because it's partway between the grocery store and the fruit and vegetable store that you're going to go to, using all your willpower to buy Brussels sprouts and broccoli. And it just happens to be a really convenient location for you. And let's imagine that every time you drive your own car to the grocery store, that parking spot is available. Every time you drive your partner's or your friend's car to the grocery store, that parking spot is full. What's the belief that you start to form about this? Well, when I drive my car, my car's lucky. My car is a good car to be in to get this parking spot, and so on. So we start to create stories for ourselves based on the experience we observe of our lives, and this happens pretty much in every dimension of our lives. If you wake up tomorrow morning and you feel a little bit sluggish and lacking energy, and that happens for a few days, it's pretty easy for you to start forming the belief that I'm not a morning person. And those beliefs then tend to stick with us. I'm not a morning person. So I'm going to say to you, hey, Jesse, do you want to come with me for a run tomorrow morning? Your response is going to be, I'm not really a morning person, but because you've had this experience repeated a few times of just waking up feeling like you're a little more sluggish than usual. So there's this intersection of our experiences, the sense we make of them, the stories that we tell ourselves about those experiences, and how we live our lives. And I think willpower is one of those things that it's easy for us to use that word to describe a set of experiences that we have in such a way that the story we tell ourselves is, I either have this quality or I don't have this quality, or I have a certain measure of this quality, but other people seem to have more of it and other people seem to have less of it, and so on. In other words, the word itself, willpower, tends to mask a whole lot of other factors that still go on. You might know the old joke about the man who gets down on his knees every night and prays that he's going to win the lottery every night. He says, please God, make me win the lottery. Please God, make me win the lottery. And he does that. Day after day, week after week, year after year, never wins the lottery. And then one night he says this prayer, and this voice comes back and says, hey, do me a favor, will you? Buy a ticket. So the narrative that we often tell ourselves is that it was luck that led me to win the lottery, or a lack of luck that led me not to win the lottery. But that masks a whole lot of other things that we may or may not be doing there that contribute to that. You're never going to win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. If you buy lots of tickets, you marginally increase the likelihood that you'll win a prize, and so on. And I think that's what willpower does. It sort of hides from us what are the critical factors in behaviour change, and gives us a convenient way of distilling it down into really a single construct or single concept that I don't ultimately think really does us any favours.
It seems like one of those things where it's like if somebody feels like they don't have willpower, it feels like this thing that everyone else has, or people are just kind of like inherently blessed with. But you're kind of saying that there's a lot more behind it than just people being blessed with more willpower, or exercising more willpower, having that muscle, or whatever it is.
Yeah. I don't think when we're born, I don't think we're sort of dosed with a certain amount of willpower, and I don't even think that willpower is the thing that develops and builds over time as we do something.
It's not the same as a muscle.
And if you exactly right, and if you think about it, it's a little bit circular too. So if you don't have willpower, well, how do you get it? Well, some people might say, well, you just kind of do the thing that you're supposed to do, but you can't because you don't have willpower. So how do you ever break this cycle? The other I think kind of problem with this idea of willpower is that for a lot of people it becomes a perceived critical failure. So they use this idea essentially to beat up on themselves. And it diminishes people's self-esteem, it diminishes their self-efficacy, it shifts their perspective of themselves unhelpfully towards seeing themselves as someone who just can't do this thing, whatever that thing may be, because they're using this construct.
It makes me think of there's two examples that immediately spring to mind. The first is historical figures. It's often the question is often asked of Alexander the Great or Henry V or any number of these, Julius Caesar, Augustus, any of these men and women from history who overcame the great odds that were stacked against them, achieved great things, built empires, conquered the world, all these sorts of things. And the question is often asked, well, how did they do it? Was it simply luck? Was it a combination of skill? And was there something innate in them that allowed them to do these great things? And it sounds like you're pushing back pretty hard on this idea that there must be something innate in a great person to be great, to achieve great things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jesse. I'm pushing back hard on that because again, when we take that perspective, we stop looking at all the other things that go on that make that possible. For example, if you think about the birth of aviation about 125 years ago, or the birth of powered aviation, I should say, the Wright brothers we often, or we typically, think of as the people who did that. A lot of that was just the time in history that they happened to be born. No matter how amazing and smart you and I are, and no matter how big we dream, we're never going to be able to invent powered aviation because that time has passed. We just live in the wrong time in history to to do that and to come up with that sort of idea. Wilbur and Orville Wright happened to be at a perfect time in history, as were many other people. Santos Dumont and several other pioneer aviators at the time. So there's a whole bunch of non-individual factors that also support that. For example, if we use the example of Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar, which is interesting because I've just spent a couple of weeks traveling through the southwestern part of Spain, which is called Extremadura, and another part of Spain up in the northeast, on the way towards Barcelona. And these were two areas which were significantly developed by the Romans a couple thousand years ago. So Roman civilizations began to emerge in these places. The Romans kind of supplanted the Celtic Iberians who were living there at the time, started building, their own bridges and aqueducts and forums and palaces and so on. Augustus Caesar was the emperor at the time, and in a historical perspective, we would often say that Augustus Caesar created, this city, or Augustus Caesar built this city. No, he didn't. Augustus Caesar happened to be the emperor at the time. He had bajillions of people working for him. He had unlimited funds to be able to do this. He had the capacity to, order people to do, whatever he wanted at the time. In turn, all of those things were supported by prevailing technologies at the time. So the Romans, for example, had discovered cement. Cement allowed those sorts of structures to be built. There were clever engineers, as far as I know. Augustus was an emperor; he was not an engineer, so it's not Augustus that dreams up this nice kind of design for an aqueduct that channels water from one part of the city to another. That was an engineer who did that, and it was the prevailing technology of the invention of cement that allowed that to be constructed. It wasn't Augustus Caesar who did that. He didn't make the Roman Empire through an act of will. So in other words, there's all of these factors well outside of us as individuals that influence what we do and how we do it and when we do it and the extent to which we experience success. Interestingly, the history books tend not to record also where those efforts didn't yield success. So, where are the cities that, perhaps were started under the reign of Augustus Caesar that kind of developed into nothing, or where the local populations pushed back against the Romans and stopped the Romans from establishing a city there? They're the things that we tend not to highlight in our own thinking, and therefore we end up with this distorted perception of how responsible we are for change individually, and what it actually means to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
In football and in cricket and so on, we award things like player of the match or player of the year, or things like that. So we create narratives about things that on the one hand can be useful to us, but on the other hand really limit our thinking and really limit our capacity to understand what it actually is that makes a difference.
Now, all this is very interesting and very helpful. However, Simon, if I were prone to extremist thinking, I might think, okay, all right. Sounds like I can't just will my way into that beach bod or become the next Mozart or become the next George R.R. Martin. So maybe I'll just sit on the couch, eat eclairs all day long, binge Netflix, and if I gain 30 kilos, okay, but maybe I'll just lose 30 kilos, and then maybe I'll also become a world famous painter or author or whatever. It sounds like it doesn't really matter what I do. Am I hearing that from you?
No, not at all. I mean, and what we do does matter, and to understand what helps us to do what we do. I don't think it helps to think in terms of willpower. So, I mean, you the way you described it to me, I could just sit on the couch all day and eat chocolate eclairs and binge Netflix and so on. Now, I'm going to ask you, Jesse, and Zanita, you too, what are the words that come to mind that you use to describe that sort of behaviour? Straight off the top of your head, don't overthink. Lazy, exactly right. I mean, we make value judgments about that sort of behaviour, but what we don't do is say, "Man, Jesse, you are an expert at eating eclairs and binging a whole series of Netflix in one go." Now, I'm saying that kind of wryly, but it actually says something very important to us, and that is that we attach values to these things. We value some behaviour, we devalue other behaviour. And again, that brings us back to this kind of morality that seems to underpin this idea of willpower. If you've got it, you're a morally good and solid person. If you don't have it, you're morally corrupt and lazy and all sorts of other things, and you just eat chocolate eclairs and binge Netflix. A more useful way to understand this is to think about all human behaviour of any type at any time as behaviour that's driven by a need. And let's go to some very, very basic creatures to think about this first. If you go to either single cell organisms or very, very basic creatures like earthworms, for example, what behaviour do you see them displaying? Well, essentially, you see them displaying eating behaviour, um, expelling behaviour. They expel the waste. And depending on how complex they are, procreating behaviour as well, so that they can perpetuate the species. But why do they do those things? Well, because there's a need there. If they don't eat, they die. If they don't expel the waste, they die. And if they don't procreate, they die out. The whole species dies. So those behaviours are driven by need. Let's now come to very, very complex beings such as us, and think about all the behaviours that we engage in. So here's a question for you two. What makes you two want to do this podcast, or what makes you do this podcast?
I think it's from a love of having great conversations, of learning, and I think I do take pleasure in it, even though there's parts of it that I don't love, but I still do it because there are parts of it that I find really very gratifying and very interesting.
And I suspect there's a part of it that you haven't necessarily named here, Jesse, and that is that for you it feels like you're contributing something useful for the benefit and well-being of other people as well. So all of these things are really significant needs that are being satisfied in you. You know, the need to feel like you're contributing to your community, your broad community, the need for joy, the need for satisfaction, the need for intellectual stimulation. All of these things get satisfied by you doing this podcast. If those needs weren't satisfied, if I sat here and answered, yeah, nah, don't know, maybe, your need for intellectual stimulation wouldn't be satisfied, and you probably wouldn't have me back on as a guest. So all of our behaviour is driven by need, and that's a much more useful way, I think, to think about what we do. If you choose to sit on the lounge and binge Netflix and eat chocolate eclairs all day, I'm not going to say you're lazy. I'm going to be curious about what is it that you need in your life that underpins that behaviour. Now, it may be that you're experiencing a great deal of stress or a great deal of overwhelm, and sitting on a lounge and just binging something fairly mindless on Netflix is a way of distracting you from that level of stress. In which case, I would say you're not being lazy. You're satisfying an important need for yourself. So for me, this idea of need that underpins our behaviour is really where we need to, really where we must focus, rather than on the idea of willpower. And in fact, if you go and review those theories of behavioural change that we talked about, you'll see that need pops up a lot in theories of behavioural change. It's identified a lot of times either explicitly or implicitly as a significant factor in behavioural change.
Simon, you touched on something just a second ago about connecting your actions to your values. Can you break that down a little bit? Because I feel like a lot of the time when we have like self-development conversations or conversations about willpower or whatever it is, people bring up this idea of values. And when you ask someone what their values are, they'll often say things like, oh, love, friends, like relationship. like they say these really big kind of vague things, and it's hard to kind of know what to do with that. Like, it's hard to kind of connect that with action. So like, can you paint a picture as to what it actually might look like to connect your actions to your values?
Yeah. That's really well put, Zanita. That if you just ask someone that very, very broad question, what are your values, you'll tend to get a very, very broad answer. Big sort of not well defined concepts, because it's a difficult question to answer. For some of us, it's difficult to answer because we don't have the vocabulary too. So one of my favorite experiments is to ask people to name emotions. Name every emotion you can, And typically the answer goes happy, sad, angry. Then there's a pause. And then the fourth emotion is named, shorter pause. Fifth emotion, longer pause. 6, 7. Most of us just don't have the vocabulary to name emotions, to name needs, to name values, and so on. And that's one of the reasons we struggle to do that. So we default to some of those things like love and friendship and so on. The way that values connect is very simply that if you think of a value as what matters to you, what's really important to you in your daily life, and our behaviour generally reflects the things that are important to us in our daily lives. We do the things that we do because at some level, in some way, they matter to us. We all have the same number of hours a day, 24, the same number of hours a week, 168. You can't extend that. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter what you're trying to do. We will all get 168 hours in a week. You've got to sleep for some of those. And so for everyone, that limits the available number of hours you have to do other stuff in your life. So generally speaking, we do the things that have value to us or that matter to us. Now, some people will say, "Oh no, that's not true because I really don't like my job, but I still go to it every day." Okay, so why don't you just quit your job? Well, because I need the money. Okay, there's what you're valuing. You recognise that you have a need for the income to be able to pay your rent or your mortgage and buy food and put fuel in your car and so on. So you're choosing to do something that you don't find as fulfilling as you wish it were, but it does meet a really important need for you, and you are doing something that really, really matters to you at some level. Someone asks you to, speak at a friend's wedding, and you say, I hate standing up in front of people speaking. I really don't. No, come on, I really, really want you to. Okay, I'll do it. So the story you might tell yourself is, I'm doing something I don't want to do. But another version of that story is you're doing something that reflects your values, and your values are, I honour and support my friends. I do things that my friends will appreciate. So for me, this is how we kind of link values, or what matters to us, needs, what we must have in our lives, and behaviour, which is the output that kind of, in a sense, ticks those two boxes. And anytime I hear someone using language like, it feels lazy, or I don't really want to do this, or it's not me, or I hate doing this, my mind always goes to, but what is being satisfied here in this? How is this helping you in some way in your life? And one of the nice things about that is that it takes us away, in behaviour change terms, it takes us away from that moral judgment about willpower. If we understand it in terms of need and value, then the discussion is no longer about whether you have willpower or don't have willpower. The discussion is about what's important to you. What needs do you have right now? How are those needs being satisfied? And how does satisfying this set of needs get in the way of you satisfying that set of needs in your life?
It's a much more helpful approach.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And it steers right away from personal judgment.
Yeah.
Also helps us to focus on the bigger picture, all those contextual factors that we talked about before. Where in your life you are, what period of life you're in, who is there, what are the surrounding circumstances, what are the resources you have, and all those other things that really contribute a significant amount to what you actually end up producing in your life.
You highlight one of the missing, potentially, puzzle pieces in this whole conversation in your article, and that's a word that I think a lot of us understand at a surface level, but maybe not so deeply, and that's habits. Could you unpack what you mean by habits and how does that play a part in this whole scenario?
Habits are simply the repetition of something that we do in our lives, and again, habits will tend to form around behaviours that have some sort of meaning to us, even if we've kind of disconnected a little bit from that meaning. So when you were little kids, when we were all little kids, we all had parents who used to march us into the bathroom after dinner every night. Get out the little toothbrush with the banana flavored toothpaste, and they'd brush our teeth until we were old enough to hold a toothbrush, and then we brush our teeth and so on. And as you grew up, you developed that habit of after breakfast each morning and after dinner each night, or before you went to bed, you would brush your teeth. Hopefully you floss once a day as well. That's very important. And you just got to build that over time. Now that you're an adult, you don't consciously link that action with a need. But the need is still there, and the need, of course, is to maintain a healthy set of teeth so that you can eat and enjoy food and speak clearly and do all those other things that matter to you in life. Nevertheless, that action of brushing your teeth has become deeply embedded in your daily life, and no doubt you link it to some other things. So when you start going through, when you start to get that sense of, oh, it's about time I go to bed, subconsciously that cues, brushing your teeth. Or if you, walk into the bathroom to put moisturising cream on your face or something like that, that cues you to pick up your toothbrush and start brushing your teeth. So we link it. We end up linking some behaviours to a whole lot of other behaviours that we do. And that's how habits form. Habits are kind of interesting because, people, there's some popular mythology around that says it takes a certain number of days to build a habit, and so on. I don't think any of that's true. I think it's entirely dependent on what the habit is, how important that behaviour is to you, and what other mechanisms you have in place to support that habit formation. So some habits will form very, very easily. A good way to demonstrate this to yourself is imagine that you trade in your old car, which has the air conditioner here and the stereo system here on the dashboard, and you buy a new car where they're reversed. Now the stereo system controls are up here and the air conditioner is down here. How long does it take you to form the new habit of reaching to the right space on the dashboard to adjust the air conditioner and not the radio? Not very long.
Not very long.
I mean, often just maybe just a matter of hours, maybe a bit longer than that. And every so often we have one of those moments where your old muscle memory kind of takes your hand somewhere else, and you turn up the air conditioner and suddenly you're deafening yourself for a couple of seconds until you turn down the volume. So we certainly do experience those momentary lapses, but in general, some habits form very, very quickly. If you move from your old house to a new house and you have to take a different bus to get to work, how long does it take you to form that new habit of getting on that new bus? Not very long. I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning and just finds themselves wandering back to their old house and their old bus stop out of force of habit. What's going on there? Well, what's going on is there's a really strong need underpinning this and driving this behaviour for you, because it's very important to you that you turn up at work on time and do your job to earn the money to pay your rent and buy your food. So again, we're back to the idea that there's a whole lot of things that help to reinforce the habit. It's not just an act of willpower on my behalf that forms that habit.
You reference a book in your article called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and he talks about this idea of like putting things in your way. So like if you want to work out more,
Yeah.
put weights
Yeah.
at your door or
Exactly
peanut
right.
bar
Yeah.
at your door, and the habit will naturally form because every time you walk out your door, you're going to see these things in your
Yeah.
way. And so you also talk about this idea of like your environment helps with your willpower. But what do you do in the situation? Like, for example, let's think of a young guy who lives with his parents, and his parents eat whatever they want, a lot of junk food, a lot of processed food, and he's really trying to abstain from that, to resist that, and create like a better diet. What do you do if you don't have control over your environment like that?
So I think there's a couple of things I might say about that. The first is I think it's important that we step away from binary ideas about environment. I can control versus I can't control. Our interaction with our environments is more complex than a binary like that. I can and can't control. There are lots of things in my environment that I can't control. I can't control the temperature of the day, for example. So I might decide to go for a morning run at 6 a.m. I can't control the outside temperature, which may be -5, or it may be 35 degrees. Those external temperatures are going to have an influence then possibly on my thinking about doing this. When it's -5, I might think, ugh. What can I control though? Well, I can put on some leggings. I can put on an extra layer of clothing. I can set the air conditioning so that I know that when I get home, I'm going to walk straight into a warm house. So there's a bunch of things in my environment that I can still control, even though I can't control the exterior temperature. So I think part of the solution to the situation you're talking about, Sunita, is to in a sense, deconstruct the environment in that way and think, okay, yeah, if you live in that house and you're not in charge of purchasing the food and other people are, you can't necessarily control that. You can't make those choices. But what are some choices you can make? Well, if you're over the age of 15 years, you can go and get a job. You can buy your own food, or at least buy some food that's going to take you in the direction that you want to take with your diet. You can look for other opportunities to get that food that's important to you. You can make requests to increase a particular type of food that you would like or you would appreciate, and so on. And above all of that, the most important thing is that you don't see this simply as a behaviour about having a good diet or not having a good diet, but you connect it to the need. So why is eating this good diet important to you? Well, because I want to be healthy. Well, now that we're talking about healthy, that gives us the possibility of exploring what other ways are there of being healthy. Diet is certainly one of them, but you can be healthy through the way you spend your leisure time, the quality and duration of sleep you get, the amount of physical activity and exercise you do, and so on. So there are still many, many choices available to you and many, many resources that you can use to begin addressing your health, even if this one particular area is challenging at the moment. So the approach that I would take is first of all to think about deconstructing the environment, and by that I mean thinking about acknowledging that there are certainly parts of it that you can't control, and there are parts over which you can exert some influence. Secondly, zooming out to that level of need and thinking about what are the other ways that need can be satisfied and how else can I engage in doing this, rather than kind of perseverating and getting stuck on this one little thing, which of course can often lead us into a downward spiral. I wish I could do this, I just can't. I'm stuck here. I can't do anything about this. I have to eat this. I can't change it. Meantime, there's a whole bunch of things sitting over here that could be addressed, that could move the needle somewhat.
Simon, this has been an incredibly helpful conversation for me, both this conversation and your article. So thank you for that. I'd like to end the conversation by posing the question that many of us ask ourselves, and then if you could suggest a more helpful question. So, at that point of failure, when we feel like, why don't I have more willpower? Why can't I achieve the things that I want to do? Why is there something wrong with me? Instead of asking that question, what would be a more helpful and healthy way to process some of the frustrations that we have around willpower?
Great question, Jesse. Great question. So if you find yourself kind of caught in that cycle of saying, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Why don't I have the willpower? The first thing that I would always encourage people to do is remember that willpower, or the word willpower, is like a shortcut that we use to try and capture our experience. And just remind yourself that it doesn't do a very good job a lot of the time, because it misses a lot of really important things. It misses a lot of factors that support behavioural change that are not just to do with us. So cognitively, intellectually, remind yourself of that. The second thing that I would do is ask yourself, why does this matter to me right now? So whatever it is, whether it's eating broccoli or Brussels sprouts, or going walking every morning, or sleeping 8 hours a night, why is this behavior important to me right now? And there's a really neat exercise you can do with yourself called the 5 whys. And as the name suggests, it involves simply asking yourself that same question 5 times. So, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just eat a plateful of Brussels sprouts? Well, why is it important for you to eat a plateful of Brussels sprouts? Well, because I know they're good for me. Why is it important for you to do something that you know is good for you? Well, because I really, I want to be healthy. Why do you want to be healthy? Well, because I don't want to get sick, and because I want to be able to work and do things that I like doing. Why do you want to keep being able to do the things that you like doing? Well, because I feel really good when I do those things. So you can see how this discourse to myself is subtly changing over time. The more I ask about why. So what I'm doing is interrogating myself about values and meaning and need and so on. So do that work. Get down quite a bit so that you have that clarity about why this is important to you. Then ask yourself, what are all the resources that I have available to me to help me satisfy that need, or help me live out that value, or whatever it might be? In other words, what you're doing is getting away from feeling entrapped by that immediate behavior, thinking more broadly about what's the need that underpins that, and then thinking about what you do have available that you can harness in the service of that, rather than simply engaging in a self-criticism of, what's wrong with me? Why don't I have any willpower to do this?
I got to say, Simon, I feel a lot better about myself, knowing that there's not anything wrong with me. I don't have weak willpower or anything like that. So thank you for breaking all of that down for us. There is a lot more in the article that we haven't actually touched on yet. So if you found this interesting, you can read Simon's article on the Science Magazine website, or in the January-February issue. It is titled, "You Don't Need More Willpower, Why Trying Harder Isn't the Answer." And if you like what Simon wrote, you can click on his name on the website and you'll find a number of other great articles he has written for us as well. So thank you again, Simon, so much for coming on.
Always a pleasure. Lovely to see you both.